Hi, everyone.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It is 9:01 Eastern time. For some colleagues, is after dinner time. So thank you for the ones joining us. We're going to start this webinar that is led by the UN Global Compact and the UNEP FI Finance Initiative, suggested to all country teams working on component one of the SDG financing call and their implementation. The idea is to really have a conversation and seeing what is the best practice to engage with the private sector, both regular sectors and the financial sector. Just to welcome everyone, I'm gonna invite Lisa Kerbiel, the head of the UN Joint SDG Fund, and also Max Riva, our investment advisor. Good morning, Lisa.
Good morning, Elaine and colleagues. Very warm welcome and good afternoon, good evening as well. Really delighted to welcome our colleagues from the Global Compact and the UNEP Finance Initiative. Really great to have also colleagues joining us from the field today to reflect upon successes and lessons learned. As many of you are probably following the group of friends conversations, this is the effort led by the missions of Jamaica and Canada here in New York. Again, they were zooming in on SDG financing just last week at the PR and at minister level. And again, they talked about how critical it is for this outreach to the private sector, right? In fact, more and more, we're seeing that that's the hardest part. We know we need a pipeline. We know we need the initiatives started, but if we don't have anyone to pitch them to, if we don't have those strategic partnerships and alliances, then really building the billions to trillions and all of our rhetoric really won't move. So really excited to listen and learn, really thrilled that we're working with all of you through the Joint SDG Fund and really excited to listen in. So I think I'll pass back to you, Elaine. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Now introducing the investment advisor of the Joint SDG Fund, Max Riva.
Thank you, and also let me join Lisa in welcoming you, all our panelists, but also for sure our colleagues in the field. We have a unique opportunity with platforms established in almost 70 countries around the world to work on SDG financing. And as we know, a lot of the work of the United Nations is embedded in public entities and public configurations, but it is as much as important to bring into the discussion the private sector. This webinar comes after a consultation with you, which you have highlighted that the engagement with the private sector, particularly in countries where the sector is smaller or it's still at nascent stage, is a challenge to bring them effectively on the discussion of SDG financing, but also as making them a vector of change. And on that basis, we wanted to bring to you some of the forerunners on engaging with the financial sector in particular. So colleagues from the UNEP Finance Initiative, and of course the Global Compact. They have established networks, they have established frameworks, they have established principles that are ways and means to bring into the discussion those players that are critical to the closing of the SDG financing gap. So we welcome really your contribution and participation today. We will administer some polls, and we look also to engage with you through the chats and to the questions. So please don't hesitate to write as we have our eminent panelists to share their experience, their views, and their reflections. So thank you again to everyone, and welcome to this webinar.
Thank you, Max, and thank you for the reminder. You're going to be using the chat not only for questions, but I will be launching polls to ask about your engagement with the private sector, as well as sharing the bios of the panelists. So now I welcome Ole Lud Hansen. Sorry, I'm going to use the chat a little bit here. And so Ole, to you, Ole is the Chief of Global Operations Team in Global Compact.
Yes, thank you so much, Elaine, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with other colleagues from the UN Global Compact and our networks, and it's a real pleasure to be with so many colleagues from the UN from all over the world. As I hope many of you know, the UN Global Compact is focused on business, we like to call ourselves the world's largest business and sustainability initiative, given the more than 13,000 companies from more than 160 countries that are now participating in the UN Global Compact. And most of what we do is really focused on challenging and supporting companies in terms of integrating the 10 principles of the Global Compact, as you know, focused on human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And of course, to work with those companies to take bold and meaningful action to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. So here, this webinar, you'll hear from our colleagues in the Sustainable Finance team on some of the work we're doing to bring a multi-sector group of corporate finance leaders together to develop innovative strategies for mainstreaming SDG investments. So that's kind of from our global team, but you'll also hear from our local networks in Brazil and in Jordan on how they locally are engaging the private sector to accelerate SDG finance and investments. So counting Jordan and Brazil, we have a total of 69 of these Global Compact networks, and they do lots of work. I hope a lot of you are familiar with them locally, everything from awareness raising, capacity building, partnerships, and policy dialogue. In the new strategy that the UN Global Compact just came out with last month, a new strategic plan for the next 3 months, one of the absolute top priorities from that strategy is really to strengthen our national and regional collaboration with resident coordinators, partnership officers, and really the broader country teams. So I think this webinar today is really a great opportunity to look at those possibilities, specifically then as it relates to the financial sector. So yeah, look very much forward to it, and happy to leave it over to Eric, I suppose, but back to you first.
Thank you so much, Ole. So just as a reminder, we are using the chat to share the bios that you saw in the agenda, but as well, feel free to raise your hand and put questions in the chat. We are monitoring it. Now I'm going to introduce Eric Usher. Eric is the head of UNEP Finance Initiative. Welcome, Eric. You're going to give a quick introduction, and then we're going to ask the colleagues from the Sustainable Finance to join, and then you're going to be back.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Elaine and Ole, and pleasure to be with you today. And I think this is a really important conversation, and I think it's very important, as you know, in traditional forms, I would say in New York and all around the world, when we talk about finance, we think about, you know, the role of the World Bank Group and the development banks who do very, very important work. But I think most of the discussion today and in general in this area is a little bit more around the role of building up the capacity of within the private sector, both in corporates, SMEs, and up to financial institutions, banks, and investors, for what can be done to mobilize the financing role they can play. It's not to say that we don't need development finance, but I think the focus is on how can you get the normal economic actors fit for purpose or in a position to actually mobilize the financing that's needed for SDG priorities. There will always be a need for development finance, but we would say it's sort of more in a complementary or gap filling mode. But the real objective long term, I think, is these economic actors, how can we get them ready to deliver? And I think that will be the main focus of the discussions today, and looking forward to contributing.
Fantastic, Eric. Thank you so much. Now, I'm going to invite to start speaking our colleague from UN Global Compact to talk about sustainable finance, Nico Ciocchi. And then Nico will introduce the two colleagues from the local networks, Jordan and Brazil, just after him. Nico, welcome.
Thank you very much, Elaine. And good afternoon, good evening, or good morning to everyone. I will start describing our global initiative at the UN Global Compact, which focuses on sustainable finance. That it's called the Cfos Task Force for the SDGs. That was launched in December 2019, building on the work that the UN Global Compact has been doing on sustainable finance since 2017, which led to different publications, including the one on SDG bonds that was launched in September 2019. So in December 2019, we launched the Cfos Task Force with 15 members from companies and banks and credit rating agencies and investors from all over the world. And we started growing our membership base from 15 at that moment to 44 right now, with 35 CFOs involved in the initiative, representing 21 industries all over the world, in basically all the continents. What we developed with our participants at the very beginning was a set of 4 principles to supplement the UN Global Compact 10 principles on human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And these 4 principles focus on the impact thesis for the companies to define which is their impact through a holistic approach, the alignment on to strategy and investments for the participants involved, the ability to go to raise from markets the capital necessary to implement investments looking at the realization of the Agenda 2030, and on investor communication and reporting. We launched this set of principles at the last UNGA in September 2020. And since then, we've been working with our participants to look at the implementation phase of these principles and how to best go into the operationalization of these principles in their industry, in their business operations, in their strategy, and as well in their supply chains. What we are looking at right now is the different challenges that are emerging from a global initiative like ours, mixing with the different local peculiarities that these companies, of course, are part of. And even more looking at multinational companies that are active in different parts of the world, how they can best emerge the different details of their participation locally into our global initiative. The way in which we are trying to shift the work from the global perspective to a local perspective was through our local networks. And without further ado, I will leave the floor to a few examples from the local network Jordan and the local network Brazil. So please, it's my pleasure to welcome you, Raj Attar, which is a member of the UN Global Compact Network Jordan and also Chief Sustainability Officer at Armex.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. It's evening at my side of the world. And it's a pleasure for us to be here. My name is Raji. I'm the chairman of the local networks in Jordan, and also I'm a private sector sustainability officer. Talking about the collaboration with the private sector, especially on the financial issues, private sector has always been or tries to shy away from participating in things that are related to development that do not bring money back. So what is in it for me? That was a slogan for many companies across the globe, especially outside, the development countries. So having frameworks and having proper strategies that would support the private sector to understand the importance of their role in the development of the countries that they are in, and currently the Sustainable Development Goals is an extremely important aspect, and it helps companies to concentrate more, focus more on where they put their efforts, moving away from philanthropy into more sustainable development. The SDGs also created a guideline for the private sector to be able to focus on some areas. Now, recently, especially in the 2020 and the COVID and everything, we've seen a lot of interaction between private sector and in the Sustainable Development Goals development and commitments. people were thinking that sustainability would just die, and people will start looking at more how do I pay my salaries to my employees, or what kind of profits I'm getting for my shareholders. And fortunately, as a private sector company, I receive almost on daily basis a request from a client, major clients, asking for our carbon emissions, our community involvement. So we saw a big increase in the engagement of the private sector in the development goals. One good example of our engagement as Global Compact Network in Jordan with the private sector and with the fund and the UN agencies, we just partnered with UNDP, Social Value International, and UN Women on promoting impact measurement and disclosure in Jordan. Our first goal was talking to the Amman Stock Exchange, which is one of the exchanges that signed the Sustainable Exchange Initiative. And we are going to start training companies who are listed on this stock exchange. Then we are moving to the Chamber of Commerce's, also supporting all companies in reporting and measuring their impact. So this shows how important it is to be or to involve the private sector in a way that would show them that there's a benefit and not just just a commitment with another UN agency that is coming to the field. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Rej, and for your insightful contribution. I would also like to now open the floor to Marcelo Linguit, which is the Partnership and Program Director from the UN Global Compact Local Network Brazil. Please, Marcelo, the floor is yours.
Hello, Nico. Good morning. Ron to you. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Well, I'd like to use my time to talk a little bit about an initiative that we started last year, focusing on the engagement of CFOs here in Brazil. This activity follows a series of other initiatives that the Global Compact Network Brazil has already conducted in terms of engaging the financial sector with the SDGs. We have a particularly long track in engaging, for example, pension funds and financial sector in Brazil in this area. And we decided last year to focus on the CFOs, and like to talk a little bit about that. The first question that we should have is why CFOs? Here in Brazil, understand that a CFO role is undergoing a historic transformation. The CFO is no longer seen primarily as a producer and analyst or analyzer of financial statements or optimizing performance. Instead, the function in this mouthpiece of focused investment, asking the right questions and providing the right insights so that everyone understands when to say no and how to say yes. And this is particularly relevant in terms of the SDGs. We understand that the CFO helps the company turn down many activities so that the few most important can thrive. And this is relevant to the SDGs when you are looking, for example, on your supply chain or on the activities that the company develop, so they can help company to avoid bad impacts or bad impacts on environment or social issues. So the deciding factor is a strategic value for us. So that's we decided to work with the CFOs. So the idea of what I'm showing you is a course focused on the development of sustainability skills within some CFOs. The activity we decided was implemented to try to bring the CFOs this new role, this new challenge that they're faced to. So we tried to focus on ESGs, another word for the SDGs or sustainability practice. We brought together 34, 35 people from 32 different huge organizations, large organizations here in Brazil. So the idea was to work with them in a collaborative project that could generate social, environmental, positive impact both for the company and both for society and environment. we decided to focus on, after the course that we had with Dan, and we had the support of the financial institution in Brazil, we decided to work on 3 issues. The first was emissions. The second issue was supply chain. But the issue that was elected by Dan was to work on with oceans. So how we could deal with plastic pollutions into the oceans. So the first step of this project was last year. So we brought them together. In the beginning of this year, we choose the issues, and now in 2 weeks from now we're going to have the third meeting, so we'll design and make the strategic design of this project that is already under development by the Brazilian network, and the project is called Blue Keepers. So it's a project that has already a small fund, but we're looking for other funds. And so we are going to take a chance of a project is already under development and bring this group of people that decided to work with the same issue, that plastic pollution in the ocean. So we decided to focus on them because of the reason I explained, and to develop a concrete project, because we understand that obviously events and courses and training programs and publications are really very good, but nothing better than than engaging them in the development and implementation of a project. Well, I think it's this, Nico. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcelo, and I will completely echo you on how we see actually the role of CFOs going forward as an incredible catalyst for the SDGs and the realization of the Agenda 2030. Elaine, to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Nico. So now I'm gonna ask Eric Usher to come back, ideally to talk about the principles for responsible investment, responsible banking, responsible insurance. So this big, long-term relationship with the financial sector. Eric?
Great. Well, thanks very much, Elaine, and good to hear from colleagues on what's being developed on the ground. I'm gonna give a sort of a short history about the evolution on sustainable finance, and where I'm going to arrive, I hope will be very relevant for the discussion today. But if you could bear with me a little bit, because I want to go back a little bit to show you how the financial sector has evolved over time. UNIP-FI, actually, we've been around for a long time. We were formed in 1992. Actually at the Rio Earth Summit, where there were a number of banks and insurance companies who attended and started to see this. Governments were discussing this notion around sustainable development, which was quite new at the time, and they realized they needed a way to learn from and feed into those multilateral discussions. But to be frank, for many years, the relationship and the work we did and how the financial sector saw this work was really a little bit, and I think many of you would know about this in terms of corporates kind of laughing at the UN, where it's the place you get to go and do a bit of flag waving, but that's it. However, things started to true up, I think, in importance. In 2005-06, UNIP-FI and the Global Compact worked together to draft a set of principles, working with the asset management industry, and to form the Principles for Responsible Investment, which were launched by Kofi Annan and a small group, I think, of 20 investors. It was the first important risk framework for how investors should integrate environmental, social, governance issues into how they do business. 6 years later, we did the same with the insurance industry to launch the Principles for Sustainable Insurance. So these are frameworks, I would say they sit sort of under the Global Compact. Global Compact would be sort of, well, what are the major principles as a corporation you need to pay attention to? And then if you're a bank, or sorry, if you're an investor within that, the PRI really gives you something which is more industry specific about how you implement. The same as the PSI for insurance. But they're risk frameworks. And the approach of the financial sector to these issues was all about, there are risks we need to be aware of. We need to make sure our financing is not going to the worst type of projects from an environmental social perspective, particularly in ways that are going to come back and impact on the investments that we're making. The real inflection point was 2015 with the signing of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. And we saw since then, I assume also on the Global Compact side, it's the first time the private sector has seen that the UN and intergovernmental negotiations are putting in place frameworks that actually really do impact on how you do business. And with that, the shift has gone from risks, it's still about managing risks, but to a period of opportunity. And we talk a lot about green finance, green bonds, financing for renewables, lots of exciting new areas that can go after to improve your business. And increasingly now, most recently, it's not only about the opportunities, but it's about the alignment of your entire business or your entire portfolio. 2019, and we'd like to talk about the climate summit hosted by Antonio Guterres in New York, was when the notion of alignment to the Paris objective on climate really took hold. And today, net zero, which is probably the most obvious example of SDG alignment, is everywhere. And it's both in the private sector, and since this past September, it's also amongst governments, where you have China, Korea, Japan, and many, many more, the Biden administration, who are committing to net zero. Within that, with the PRI, we have a group of investors called the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and they're very, very ambitious. And now I think, as we all know, it's not only about committing to net zero by 2050. Really, that's kind of for our children, our children's children to worry about. It's what we're doing right away, which is required. So it requires here financial actors, being investors, to actually put out very clear methodologies which are based on the science, so the IPCC, about how they're going to lower emissions within their portfolios. And the AOA, we call it the Asset Owner Alliance, they've put out a target setting protocol about how they're doing it, and they've started to issue their targets. And their focus is not 2050, the focus is 2025. So it's 5 years from now, what reductions they intend to put in place and how they're going to do it at a sectoral level to actually deliver in aligning their portfolio with this sustainable development objective. Now, I haven't mentioned banking yet. And when we come to the global south, the reality is investors are important, insurers are important, but most financing still comes through the banks. Upwards of over 90% of financing for private sector activities comes via banks, and therefore they have to be involved. And ever since the PRI was launched, the question was, well, okay, what about the banks? And the usual response is, oh, banking, it's a very complicated business. We have principles, we have the Equator principles, we have the green bond principles more recently. So we have a lot of frameworks to help us make sure our business is green. But the difference was, these are transaction-oriented frameworks, and those are needed. But, and I like to talk about the elevator analogy. When you ride the elevator and you have the chance to have a couple words with the CEO of an asset owner or a pension fund versus a banking CEO, when you ask them the question what they're doing about sustainability or environmental social issues, ESG issues, the investor will typically tell you, oh, I'm a signatory to the PRI, versus the banker will say, yeah, we're a signatory to the Equator principles. And then if you ask them, do they know the principles? The odds are the investor CEO actually knows what the 6 principles are of the PRI. And they probably also know about the 10 principles of the Global Compact. And the reason being, the principles are written from a strategic perspective, and they're really written for those that run companies that at a high level describe what they should be thinking about. If you ask the banker, they will not know what's in the Equator principles, because the Equator principles are 18 pages long in the most recent version. They're not meant for strategic orientation. They're meant for making sure specific transactions are done in a manner where you do the right sort of due diligence, and it's very, very technical in nature. So what was missing on the banking side was something more strategic. And in post-2015, the banks started getting a lot of pressure, And then 2018, they started, and we convened a group of global banks to basically draft a set of principles for responsible banking. Now, I'm going to focus specifically on these principles. They're very important, and I think that they're indicative of how the overall industry has evolved, because they're not a risk framework. The assumption is that most banks have the basic risk frameworks in place already. What they are is a impact and alignment framework. Principle 1 basically says we will endeavor to align our businesses with the needs of individuals as defined by the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and other relevant frameworks. So it's about alignment of your business. And the way you get alignment is, one, by putting the capacity to understand impact into place, the systems to measure impact. And this is a big step up for a bank to actually say, it's not only how much financing we provide, it's actually what is our financing being used for, and are we able to actually measure and add up essentially what is our total impact in delivering clean water systems, in delivering clean energy, in addressing financial access, poverty alleviation, climate objectives. This is a big change for banks to actually increasingly start to think about what is the purpose, the impact of their financing. Now, once you start to have the systems to measure, like in any business, you actually need to start setting business objectives, or what we call targets. And that's the second step. And so signatories to this framework for the principles for responsible banking basically is about defining your purpose through alignment, and then putting in place systems to measure impact, and then setting targets to make material improvements in impact. At any one time, it could be in different target areas, but you need to publish and be working on at least 2 major target setting objectives at any one time. Now, this impact really is the entry point for understanding the SDGs, because if we're going to measure impact on society, the SDGs, and I think as all of us today will admit, the SDGs have been picked up by the private sector, really is a very useful compass to understand how do we understand our business and what are we contributing to. The SDGs actually is appropriate tool to help in defining that at a high level. When we do target setting, the banks are expected to do it either individually or in a collective way. And the collective version is essentially what we do. And today there's 210 banks are signatories to the PRB. Together they account for a little over 40% of the global banking industry. So it's mostly the big banks, but in a very large number of countries, it's over 50 today, from all parts, all continents. And essentially, collective target setting is the ability to get them to identify which areas they're interested in and then to put them together. So climate is certainly one area they're working on collective targets, but also areas like gender equality, ecosystem health, circularity, financial access, and other areas. So it really allows us to start grouping together banks to establish areas where they want to increase and improve their impact, and then work with others across the industry in the region, but also globally, to develop the common methodologies to do so. An important part of any work in this area is accountability, to be credible in what you're doing. The approach that PRB has taken is 2-part. One is they have reporting, but for the first time for the financial sector, this reporting has to be assured, which means you need to get third-party reviews of the reporting you provide to improve the credibility. And the banks have also established a civil society advisory body, recognizing the very important role that civil society plays in identifying key issues that they should be considering. Now, just my final points here are, if we're getting banks to start working individually and together on addressing SDG priority areas, whether that's climate or the other 16 SDGs, they're starting to do things which is quite similar to what governments are doing in terms of policy planning processes. I think of the nationally determined contributions on the climate side and the parallels in all other SDG areas. And so it then lends us, and this is where I come full circle around, to the potential to get governments and the private sector here, the banking industry, but also other corporates, in actually closing the gap in understanding. So if governments are setting a certain climate ambition and knowing that they need to have so much capital mobilized and that most of that will have to come from the private sector, it's quite useful for them to hear from the banks about what are the banks expecting to do in that market, how much financing do they expect to mobilize in that topic area. Let's say it's the energy sector. How much are the banks expecting to put into green energy? How much are they expecting to take out of current high fossil energy forms? So it provides the potential to have a very strong, I think, mutual signaling or dialogue between public and private aimed at trying to address and solve these global challenges, using the SDGs really as the compass and the framework to do that. I will stop at that. Hand it back to you, Elaine.
Thank you so much, Eric. We have a number of questions already. I'm going to be moderating them with the panelists. But just before that, Max Riva, our investment advisor of the Joint SDG Fund, would like to bring a couple of comments on the poll that we started about 20 minutes ago with participants. Max?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, colleagues, Eric, Nicolas, and all the colleagues from that spoke on these interesting experiences, and also I think it was quite illuminating also the trajectory, right, that we moved, and also to try to speculate on what is also the trajectory in the future, and how this also shift in the way that the UN is organizing its work, it's organizing its planning and the financing discussion with the government can bring in and scale up those experiences and possibly implementation and adoption of the different frameworks that were developed. I just wanted to, we launched a poll, and thank you for all to the ones that responded, and it quite tells us of the situation right now, and also how to think also about the discussion also to our panelists as they get through the questions made by colleagues. So we ask first if your program, and we are, as said, those programs are active in about 69 countries, if they are engaging the financial sector, and if they are planning to engage them in the short term. And the answer is 90% yes. So, you know, almost the totality of those programs are planning this work. So that's why it's very important that we learn from initiatives that are in play for sometimes over than 20 years, right, through a different trajectory, and how to make sure that those initiatives are adapted to the very specific local context. The second question we ask, if you actually did try to engage, did you have the information or the right expertise? And over 2/3 say no. So this was a bit also the origin of this webinar, and also the origin of why we called upon also other UN entities that might not be participating in the implementation of the joint programs to share their expertise, to share their experience. So we really welcome the also ways from our colleagues to interact with the countries where it makes sense. Of course, not in all the countries will be possible or relevant. The third question that we ask is, and we have noticed it everywhere, is actually companies and financial sector getting to the UN. And the question was, were your program or your organization contacted by the financial sector? And about 41% say yes. So even in a situation where there might not be a coherent plan, or they might not be implemented by the United Nations, there is a kind of a natural process where the sector actually contacts the UN. And of course, we should try to get all advantages from that. So I'll stop here. So just a few reflections from our colleagues in the field, and the situation of those joint programs as we answer the questions. But please continue to write your questions either in the chat box or in the question and answer box. And over back to you, Elaine, and thanks again to the colleagues.
Thank you, Max. We're going to start sharing your questions to the panelists, so feel free to continue to write your questions. Just a quick note, this webinar recording will be available, and please, in the end of the webinar, also make sure that you answer our survey, because it is very important for us how to engage with learning webinars with the UNCTs. So now, I'm gonna start with Eric. with a question from Raiden Al-Sakaf, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering your surname. The impact on people and planet. In the principles, do banks calculate the cost of waste and emissions and other unaccounted externalities into the feasibility analysis of financing proposals? How are these calculations done? Can you give an example, please, to illustrate? And thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Very good and key question. I think as many people know, impact management is a very, it's a increasingly deepening field, an important field. But I still don't think we have everything that we need there. So there's a lot of work going on. Our program, it's called Positive Impact. And if you look at the unipfi.org, you'll find information on the program and tools. I think the short answer is absolutely. The methodologies are meant to capture those dimensions. But we also need to, in terms of all of the impacts areas that need to be analyzed, top-down tools definitely have limitations. And so the tools we have are applied to all sectors, but I don't want to say that that doesn't mean that there aren't other tools that might be focused in specific areas of industry and different sectors that might be more detailed in certain ways. So the shorter answer is yes, they should. I think the long answer is they do, but maybe there's still a lot of work that needs to be goes on. There's something called the Impact Management Project, the IMP, which is a platform where various organizations, including ours, take part to try to get clarity on uniform approaches to impact management. And UNDP, IFC, many actors are trying to develop these methodologies. I think it's still a bit of learning by doing, but as I mentioned with the banks, and as you would know well, I think in all corporates, you need tools that are useful and applicable. It's not necessarily, you have to, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater in terms of, you need something that's credible, but you also need something that's applicable. And I think we're still learning, and there are a lot of approaches out there. And I don't want to say at this point that any one approach solves that issue.
Thank you so much, Eric. Please stick with us because there'll be more questions for you. Now I'm going to address one for Nico. If I can ask something specifically about SDG metrics. Audrey Misquith asked if she is wondering if the panelists could talk about some key SDG metrics or indicators that have been welcomed and integrated by the private sector in their operations, and which metrics are more broadly acceptable. So it's really about measurement and the SDGs per se. Nico, can we have you on this one?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Audrey, for the questions. Well, I would like to start with the talking about when we talk about SDG indicators and targets, the 169 underlying the 17 goals, we can see them as not always easily transferable to real economy companies. But one example that we have seen from participants in our task force, especially in the electric utility industry, is how companies were able to deploy and create and deploy KPIs that are aligned to these indicators. I'm thinking such an example on About Enel, which is an Italian company which focuses on electric utility, and they were able to align some KPIs at their strategic level with goals 7, 11, and 13, and also at the operational level while issuing the very first SDG bond back in 2019, on how the structure of the bond itself will increase or decrease the interest they are paying to the lenders based on their percentage of their generated capacity, which comes from renewables. So what we've seen from the private sector due to our experience is that a transposition to an effective and operational metrics that are aligned with the one developed in 2015 is definitely possible, and these can come out of peer discussion from between companies within their peers, both in the same industry and both in other industries.
Thank you, Nico. Now I'm going to have a question for directly to Marcelo with the Brazil network experience. Marcelo, Raiden Al-Sakaf is asking, how does network influence urban planning and investments in infrastructure at the central and local levels to encourage green and net zero cities, given the additional upfront costs?
Right. Well, thank you for the question, Haidan. Yes, we have developed this a part of the project, or an area of the project is focused on government and our relation with government and with public policy. So the idea of this project that the CFOs decided upon to work with is will be divided into some areas: infrastructure, collection system of waste management, the oceans, legislation, and public management. Related to infrastructure, the project has an output that is the delivery of different infrastructures within the cities that will both support the decrease or the combat to waste pollution, plastic pollution in the oceans, as the decrease of emissions within the city. So we are not planning to rearrange, let's say, the urban system or roads, or avenues and no, but what we're trying to do is to develop infrastructure system for waste management that will both collaborate to emissions. And this is important because we are also planning, and the project has this specific topic that is to use blended finance. And this is an interesting topic for us in Brazil that we have discussed, how to use blended finance for the SDGs development. You know that blended finance implies the mixing of both public and the private funds through a common investment scheme. So the idea is also to bring these CFOs and the companies they represent together with public investment, so we can put money in this project and support waste management, combat, and emission decrease as well.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. Now a question for Raji in Jordan. How SMEs can be incentivized to adopt the SDGs and be more responsible to be part of the global compact? Big corporations are much easier to have this dialogue with, given their structure, reporting, and internal policies. It's a question from Hussan Al-Khayali.
Yes, Hussam is a friend of mine, so I know.
So it's a planted question.
Yeah, actually, it's been a dilemma. I've been running the local network for the past 4 years in Jordan, and we usually get SMEs coming to us to be part of the Global Compact for different reasons. Some of them because they are suppliers of bigger companies, or some of them just wanted to be there because they are interested to be there. They like the concept and everything. I think the first step, and I think UNGC has already worked on that, is that you cannot say, I cannot have a company that has less than 10 people part of Global Compact. You need to include anybody, because small consulting companies, engineers, doctors are 2-3 people in that company. So you cannot just exclude these people there. The second thing is, and which is extremely important, is working with the corporates and the private sector, whereby they intensify the SMEs by telling them, listen, if you adopt the SDGs, then you are a preferred supplier for us. So this way, the SMEs would make sense. It would make sense for SMEs to be able to join Global Compact, adapt the SDGs to be preferred suppliers for bigger companies within the countries they are operating in. And maybe working with the governments, whereby if the SME is a committed SME to SDGs, doing COP end of the year, then the government would do some incentives in collaboration with the UN and the local private sector companies. So I think that's the best approach to bring them in.
Thank you, Raji. Please stay with us. Maybe you have other friends joining with more questions. Now I'm gonna get back to Eric. Eric, if I can ask you specifically, there's a question from Kenya that I think you are in the best position to answer. It would be useful to hear of any successful experiences in establishing de-risking funds to crowd in private sector investors and financiers to non-traditional poor and remote areas to leave no one behind. The fund can promote on to other geo areas once we have a critical mass of private actors in place. It's a question from Arif in Kenya. Maybe Eric, you can direct this one.
Well, thanks. I mean, I think there's two dimensions to this, as I think I mentioned at the very beginning. There is a need potentially for blended finance solutions, as we've already heard, you know, there are a lot of options. I think there's some successful layered funds and other approaches for sharing risks with the private sector. Obviously, there's a community, including based out of Nairobi, around the private equity space that are set up to take higher risk, although often targeting investments like in renewables, which are not necessarily, I think, the type you're thinking of. But I think part of the potential we really believe is if the conventional financial sector actors, so the banks, can build their capacities to better understand or to really get a clear understanding of the client needs. There are places where commercial actors, like in Kenya, the Kenya Commercial Bank, who they're signatory of the PRB, and they've, I think, done some good work where they can actually start to be financing without necessarily the need for blended finance, but where they actually need skills development in-house. And just to give you an example, if we talk about climate transition at the household level, the reality is most changes that a household could undertake, let's say with a more efficient cooking technology or a solar home system, all of those technologies are capital intensive. So they need financing. But one of the big barriers is the traditional technology didn't actually need financing. So the banks have no idea of the market opportunity related to household cooking, let's say. So a lot of the getting going is really just building up their capacity to understand what the market potential is. And so I think in terms of the resources that can be applied, sometimes resources or financing can be unlocked by building the skills of the commercial financial actors. And sometimes it'll rely on a public sharing of risks or structures to around opportunity sharing. And that's where the development bank community comes in. I'll stop at that.
Eric, thank you. Thank you for your answer. I'm going to continue to throw some questions at you because I think, of course, the financial sector represent a big start for a lot of us. There is a question from Ifoda in Cambodia. What is our mechanism to bring private sector financing? Is it joint programs? Do we have examples?
Well, I mean, obviously there are many things that need to be done. We deal more at the normative level. So it's in some ways, I think, similar to the Global Compact, what you're doing in terms of how do we establish the norms for responsible conduct. And, you know, more of it is trying to help commercial actors do a better job of what they're doing. Not to say that other financing, you know, public finance needs to come in to also help. But then you break it down to say, well, in different areas, how you build the norms, it's based on, you know, a number of things. And in many areas, it's getting the clarity on if you're going to talk about aligning with what. If we talk about gender equality, for instance, banks need to understand, you know, what are strategies to try to get gender parity across different lines within our organizations, within our staffing. Of course, the big challenging thing is, once again, it's not within the organization, it's the organizations you finance and what sort of expectations you put on those organizations, let's say from a gender perspective. We start to hear increasingly strong evidence that companies that employ a gender balanced approach actually are lower risk and higher performing. So there's good rationale to, at the biggest area, to understand that objective, but how a bank actually takes that and puts it into place in terms of, well, who should we be financing? What sort of due diligence should we be asking when we're working with our clients, whether it's SMEs or whether it's corporates? All of those tools are yet to be developed, most of them, or they exist, but in some form, whereas the bankers don't usually get too sophisticated. They want things very, very simple, sort of checkbox. It has to be translated into a format that they understand.
Thank you, Eric. Ole, I'm not seeing you. Maybe you can open your mic. I would try to direct a question to you in operations. Ole, are you there? Maybe not. So, Eric, if I may take a little bit of more of your time, there are two questions that I think we should try to address. The one is engaging with companies that are high risk can be hard to do so in terms of getting due diligence clearances, but necessary to step out of the preaching to the core. Any experience in engaging with these high risk companies, and in what levels of engagements are possible? And if I also may throw at you some specific questions on SIDS, Small Island Development States, if we have examples that work there, because again, processes are heavy at the UN and can be overwhelming to both government and private sectors.
Yeah, I mean, we would like to take a whole of system approach, and we hear a lot, talk a lot about divestment and the need for investors to take financing away from, let's say, coal industries. And there's been progress there, but the reality is companies and industries that are in trouble typically don't care about their investors any longer because the investors have given up on them. And it's the bankers actually who have a lot more influence on those companies who are in trouble, largely because banks see their value as being, they focus their customers, they finance their customers, and they work with those customers to figure out what businesses they're going to do. And so I think that we would say the answer to the question is, how can we develop the dialogue between the banks, in some cases the insurers, because insurance is very important for industries. Even industries in trouble need insurance to operate. So how can we foster that dialogue on specific issues so that they know the questions they should be asking? And as we talk about the, let's say, the climate resilient or the low carbon transition, there are a lot of industries that are under, or all industries are under a lot of pressure. And I think the progressive bankers, insurers, others, they're realizing that there's value in having knowledge they can help their clients overcome the challenges and figure out how to navigate this uncertain way forward. And I think our role in the Global Compact in the UN is to say, well, how can we make sure these commercial actors have the information they need to make sure they can actually help navigate each other in the value they have in the system to make sure they're heading in the right direction, rather than doing this disconnect, the divestment, or basically saying, so we're no longer going to deal with you. Most of the change that's going to happen is going to be some new Teslas, there's going to be some great new companies, but most of the change is going to have to be, we need to change the existing economic actors to get them to figure out how to decarbonize or to alter their businesses to help contribute to the SDGs, rather than thinking there's going to be some startup that's going to solve the problem every time.
Thank you so much, Eric. We have a couple of more questions coming up. One I would like to offer to Nico again. Nico, any advice on recommended processes of institutionalizing cooperation with private sector actors, CSOs, for RCOs around SDGs? For instance, memorandums of understanding, letters of intent, or other means of institutionalizing cooperation?
Yeah, absolutely. One example that we've been seeing at local levels were from the Global Network Brazil here in this webinar, and also from other local networks. Actually, I'm thinking about the Turkey one, who have established their own platforms to talk about sustainable finance within the participants in their country. The way that we see this being more effective has been in actually trying to keep up the work with the group on a monthly basis and trying to set ambitious targets as well as meaningful operations for the actors involved. This, of course, leads to also the understanding of the different composition of which this sustainable finance group should have. And one example that we are trying to, in a way that we are trying to work at it at the global level, is that we, as a global company, of course, we focus more on real economy companies, but in our CFO task force, we have as well banks, investors, credit rating agencies, even some legal partners, in order to see the full picture of from that a real economy company may face when going into understanding how to best finance their investments there towards the Agenda 2030. So I would say that it will really depend on the kind of program that is about to be rolled out. But we, from a global compact perspective, we have likely the great help from our local networks, which are already established in almost 70 countries and are able to already give that kind of structure that is needed to then create and develop a platform among peers.
Thank you so much, Nico. We are reaching the hour of our presentation, and I don't think we have any other open questions. So at this point, I would really like to remind all the participants that we are sharing materials, we are sharing links, and also please answer to our webinar because to our survey. It really is helpful for us to prepare for other webinars and follow up on this one. Feel free to reach out to our colleagues from UNEP FI, Global Compact, and I would really like to thank on behalf of the Joint SDG Fund to the colleagues from the networks in both Brazil and Jordan that came to talk to us. Any final words from Eric, Nico? Feel free to use the stage, but in any case, I think we'll be closing, and Max, if you can finish the recording after this, will be fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. And please, Eric and Nicola, any further thoughts or also suggestions to our country teams, perhaps in what could be also some next steps before we formally close the webinar?
I mean, just from my side, as I think I've said earlier as well, I do find UN Ambition is a very important tool. We talk a lot about what's the purpose of the private sector, what's the purpose of finance? And I think there's more clarity through the SDGs and the Paris Agreement today about that notion. And we start to see it from various parts of the private sector today. So I think we're well positioned, I think, by working together to help bring the tools that the different actors need to ratchet their ambition, and through that, hopefully help deliver on some of these very ambitious objectives.
Yeah, and from my side, one way that I think it's very powerful when approaching the private sector on the SDGs is to let them understand the SDGs as a real opportunity, because too much often the SDGs are only seen as a risk framework that has to be adopted in order to understand what to avoid doing in the future. But really trying to shift that into looking at the SDGs as a real opportunity for growth and for more stability. Such an example, we've seen how companies who were more sustainability aligned have performed better during the COVID pandemic at the very beginning, thinking in March, June 2020. The way that we have to promote the work with the private sector is looking at SDG as a real opportunity for the future of their operations, and also for the continuity of their business operations.
Thank you, and thank you, Nicola, Eric, and also colleagues, Ole, and all colleagues from G and Marcelo, who were kind enough to share their experience at the country level. As the different programs move into implementation, we really look forward to hear from you from the field and to share your experience while trying to do that. it's also to remind ourselves that this webinar is to share ideas, attract your attention. But there are several tools, webinars, specific training that are being organized by the very same organizations that are here. So if you are interested, please do give us a line in the survey, etc., because there is much more available. So this is if you wish, a showroom to some of those initiatives, but there is much more content and work and preparation behind those. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks, Lisa, for introducing the meeting, and all our participants for joining us today. We very much appreciate your time. Have a nice day. Have a nice evening. Thank you, everyone. The meeting is closed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day.